My name is Allison Blythe. I'm a senior capstone student at Heidelberg University in Tiffin, Ohio when recording this presentation on December 14th, 2020. For my research project, I studied the role of the First Lady of the United States. I had four main research questions shaping my research and my paper. The first question was, who is the First Lady of the United States? The First Lady is not necessarily the wife of the president, as most people think, but is more broadly a term for the person who fulfills a distinct role in American politics that is usually held by the wife of the president. The second question, how has she been studied historically, led to an exploration of the relatively new field of First Lady Studies, which is a subfield and cross-section of American history, presidential studies, and women's history. The third question, what does the First Lady do and why is she important, was the most important to me, because here I had a chance to define the role for myself and develop my argument for why she is important and why her underrepresentation in scholarly sources and college courses should be rectified. Finally, I thought about other possible ways to study the role of the First Lady not discussed by the foundational First Lady scholars. And my answer to this question was informed by my concurrently studying the First Lady for this project and her counterpart, the President, in my American Presidency course. In this presentation, I will briefly discuss my answers to each of these four questions. To start, who is the First Lady of the United States? She is both a person and a role. The First Lady term is a title for the President's wife as well as a specific role, and her definition of who should be called the First Lady, who fulfills the role versus the presidential spouse, informs how you study this role. It is important to note that the First Lady's role is culturally constructed, not constitutionally mandated. The wife of the president does not have to be the person who fulfills the role, whether because the president does not have a wife and picks another close female relative, or because the wife simply does not want to fulfill the role. Both the president and the First Lady's roles are unique American institutions. There is no position quite like either of these roles, and that is especially true for the First Lady. Both roles have a measure of a ceremonial aspect. The president is an elected representative of the people, but the First Lady is not. However, the First Lady has social obligations through her role as the presidential hostess. These baseline roles of the First Lady are the longest standing and arguably are the most important. Going back to the idea that the First Lady's role is culturally constructed, the impact of precedent on the role of the First Lady is huge. Martha Washington set the initial precedent and formed the first two roles of ceremonial figure and hostess, much like her husband George set precedents for the presidents who came before him. The role has grown in responsibilities over time, just like the role of the president has, as women's rights increase in general and to match the power of the president. Today, the idea of the role of the First Lady being optional is much less achievable for modern First Ladies because of the public pressure to fulfill the role. Now let's turn to discussing how the role has been studied historically. The field of First Lady studies first appears in the late 1980s. The foundational authors I will briefly introduce, therefore, are still very influential. Just a side note, there are biographies of specific First Ladies before this period. It's specifically studying the role that is relatively new. Betty Boyd Caroli's First Ladies, The Ever-Changing Role is the #1 text for anyone who wants to start exploring the First Ladies. Caroli has information on every First Lady, unlike many, and studies both the president's wives and the person actually fulfilling the role. While Caroli does not fully recognize the importance of the early First Ladies to the extent that she should, this book should still be the first stop for anyone wanting to learn more about the First Ladies. Robert Watson is also important for his development of 3 frameworks through which to study the First Lady. His first framework is historical, identifying trends across several First Ladies in similar time periods. His second framework is political, or identifying the number of different political behaviors an individual First Lady does, from filling a ceremonial role to taking on a pet project to taking a part in the legislative process. His final framework is levels of influence, and this framework is more nebulous in terms of where to place individual first ladies. First ladies can have political influence in their own right. Think Hillary Clinton. They can have pillow influence through being their husband's behind the scenes advisors, and historically, this has been a more prevalent role, a more prevalent level of influence. Or they can have public influence where the first lady has some control over public opinion. The final author I will discuss in this presentation, but not in my paper, is Edith Mayo, the director of the Smithsonian exhibit on the First Ladies. Mayo controls the way the American public views the First Lady through this heavily attended exhibit, and also writes about the role itself. Mayo is particularly important when it comes to discussing the political impact of the ceremonial and hostessing roles. The next big question is, what does the First Lady actually do? Going back to who the First Lady is, my answer to that question, the First Lady, first and foremost, is a social hostess and ceremonial figure. I am about to read a very important section of my research paper discussing this aspect of the role. Mayo argues guest lists to presidential events give the president an opportunity to cement political and personal relationships, enhance relations with Congress, the judiciary, and the diplomatic corps, and to recognize outstanding citizens from all segments of society, and that a woman who is both socially adept and politically savvy could promote her husband's political agenda and structure the style and image of the presidential administration. The First Lady, when her role is performed well, can have an enormous impact on her husband's ability to promote his own policies with the other branches of government and eventually the people as a whole by helping him build relationships. As presidential historians Milkus and Nelson point out, as most presidents since George Washington had recognized, presidential authority requires a certain measure of ceremony, which his First Lady can help provide. Just because this political impact is less direct does not make it less important or less effective. The First Lady also provides emotional support to the president and takes care of his non-political needs. She can act as a confidant or political advisor. Presidents in recent decades have been more open about recognizing their wives' opinion being influential upon them than they have been in the past. But even as early as 1797, John Adams told his wife and First Lady Abigail, "I must now repeat this with zeal and earnest. I can do nothing without you." In the 20th and 21st century, the First Lady has slowly become more and more involved in the campaign process. She also helps shape public opinion while in office, helped by the growing accessibility to the American public as technology advances. Eleanor Roosevelt, for example, had a newspaper column. Even before her, there were First Ladies that would talk to the public through the radio, and now there's the television and the internet. And the president also takes advantage of this growing technology to shape public opinion. Finally, the First Lady can affect policy and legislation. This is the most recent development in the role of the First Lady and of the President. First Ladies today are expected to, at the very least, have pet projects of social issues that they want to help out with, such as the literacy campaigns of Barbara and Laura Bush or Michelle Obama's Just Move campaign. Finally, I found a new way to consider how to study the role of the First Lady, shaped by my experiences studying the President and the First Lady concurrently. Another quote from my paper. The existing frameworks through which to study the First Lady fail to take into consideration the relative role of the President. The power the President has, and what is expected out of him, impacts what the First Lady is able to accomplish. The role of the President shapes what the First Lady is able to do, but the way that the First Lady fulfills her own role impacts the success of the President as well. By looking at both roles from a historical perspective, the growth and expectations on the First Lady is contextualized. In addition, if the roles are studied concurrently, it becomes easier to see how First Ladies fit into American and presidential history, helping scholars decide how best to include her within the textbooks in a natural way. In my paper, I then go into looking at both roles historically, starting with the early presidents and First Ladies. The early First Ladies are the ones that they start and cement the social hostessing and ceremonial roles. At this time, presidents are not very involved in the legislative process. It doesn't make sense for first ladies to be involved in policy decisions and to be impacting the legislative process when the president also does not do so at that given time. So, what the first lady is actually able to accomplish is partially controlled by what the president is able to do, what he wants to do, all of those sorts of things. And the modern presidency and modern first lady both start with Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. And that's when a lot of roles for both the president and for the first lady expand dramatically. To conclude, the first lady is a person and a role that holds a specific place in American government. The field is new, but growing. Foundational authors Caroli, Watson, and Mayo are a good place to start reading for anyone interested in the field. The role of the First Lady has grown over time, but the long-standing roles of being a ceremonial figure and social hostess are as important as ever. Historians should consider studying the First Lady alongside the President in order to bring another layer of depth to the field, and to better connect the First Lady to presidential and American history. You can find a PDF of my paper linked below. If you would like to read more about the First Lady, here are some